She had 40 minutes to save everything her father built. And the one man standing between her and disaster was someone nobody had ever bothered to learn the name of. An $80 million aircraft, a sabotaged engine, a contract worth more than the company itself. And buried somewhere inside that silent, beautiful machine was a secret designed to kill. The engineers had checked everything. The systems looked clean. The logs showed nothing wrong. But Mason Reed was staring at the floor, and he was the only one in that hangar who understood what the floor was trying to say. But before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you've ever been the person in the room that nobody listened to, hit that like button. This one is for you. The alarm on Eleanor Madison's phone went off at 4:47 in the morning, and she was already awake. She'd been awake since 3, lying in the dark of her Chicago penthouse with the contract document spread across the duvet beside her, reading the same paragraph for the 4th time without absorbing a single word. That was the thing about pressure, real pressure, the kind that came with a company's survival attached to it. It didn't actually help you focus. It just sat on your chest and made breathing slightly more effort than it should have been. She got up, showered, dressed in the charcoal blazer she'd had dry cleaned specifically for today, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window for exactly 2 minutes watching the city below, not care about any of it. Chicago at 5 in the morning looked the same as Chicago on any other morning. Cold, indifferent, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her. She picked up the contract folder and left without eating breakfast. Madison Aero Systems had been her father's company first. Raymond Madison had started it 31 years ago out of a converted warehouse in Indiana with 4 employees, 2 of whom were his brother-in-law and a college friend who didn't know anything about aircraft engineering but was willing to learn. He'd built it into something real, mid-market private aircraft maintenance contracts, then component manufacturing, then a slow and stubborn climb into the design division that most people in the industry had told him would bankrupt him inside of 3 years. It hadn't, but it had come close, twice. Eleanor had watched her father navigate both of those near collapses from the kitchen table, surrounded by legal briefs and spreadsheets, eating cold soup at midnight because he'd forgotten dinner again. She'd been 12 the first time, 19 the second. By the time she took over the company at 34, she understood something that couldn't be taught in a business school. The difference between a company that survives and a company that doesn't is usually not the product. It's the person willing to keep choosing it when everything says to walk away. She'd been making that choice for 6 years. Today was supposed to be the day it paid off. The Harwick federal contract was not the kind of opportunity that arrived twice. $420 million spread over 7 years. Government-adjacent infrastructure work, specifically the maintenance and systems integration for a new fleet of regional monitoring aircraft being commissioned through a public-private partnership with the Department of Transportation. Madison Aeros was one of 3 finalists. The presentation in Washington was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Eleanor had been preparing for it for 11 weeks. Not preparing in the sense of slide decks and rehearsed talking points. Preparing in the sense of sleeping 4 hours a night and personally reviewing every technical specification her team submitted, because she had learned the hard way that the details people assumed she wouldn't check were the exact details that came back to embarrass the company in a room full of federal evaluators. The private airfield was 40 minutes south of the city. She arrived at 6:15 with Connor Vail already waiting on the tarmac beside the aircraft stairs, holding 2 paper coffee cups and looking annoyingly composed for 6 in the morning. Connor was her chief operating officer and had been with the company for 9 years. Longer than she had technically, though he had been a mid-level logistics coordinator under her father before Eleanor had elevated him to the executive team. He was good at his job. Precise, efficient, reliable, in the way that well-maintained infrastructure was reliable. You only noticed it when something went wrong. "Weather's clean to D.C., he said, handing her a cup. "Flight time is 2 hours 20. You'll have 40 minutes at the hotel to change and review before the car picks you up." I don't need 40 minutes. "You'll want 20, at least."
The Harwick team sent a revised agenda last night, added a technical Q&A segment before the main presentation. Eleanor took the coffee and looked at the aircraft. The Meridian G700. Her aircraft technically, though the company had financed it and it appeared on the balance sheet under operational assets, sat gleaming under the hangar lights, every surface clean. The kind of quiet machine confidence she had always found more reassuring than she probably should have. When did the agenda change come in? Around 11. I forwarded it to your tablet. She hadn't looked at her tablet after 10. She filed that away and drank her coffee. Oh.
The pilot, a methodical former Air Force captain named Rhonda Garrett, was running through pre-flight checks when Eleanor boarded to drop her bag and review the new agenda. The interior of the aircraft was configured for working travel, a single long table along the port side, 4 seats, power connections at every position. Eleanor had spent enough hours in this cabin that it felt less like luxury and more like a second office, which was exactly how she thought about it. She was halfway through reading the revised agenda when she heard Rhonda's voice from the cockpit, clipped and professionally neutral in the way that pilots were trained to be when something was wrong. "Ms. Madison, I need you off the aircraft for a moment." Eleanor set down the tablet. The engine wasn't starting, not the dramatic failure of something obviously broken. No sparks, no smoke, no noise that announced itself as catastrophic, just an absence. The system initiating, running its sequence, and then returning to silence where there should have been ignition. Rhonda tried it twice more while Eleanor stood on the tarmac in the early morning cold, watching through the cockpit window as the pilot's expression did the careful work of not showing concern while clearly feeling it. By 6:40, there were 4 engineers from the airfield's maintenance staff gathered around the aircraft. By 7, there were 6, and the conversation had developed the specific quality that Eleanor had come to recognize over years of running a company. Everyone speaking with authority, no one saying anything useful. Could be the fuel control unit. I already checked the fuel control unit. Then check it again, because something's not... The electrical diagnostic shows clean across the board, which means the problem isn't... The diagnostic showing clean doesn't mean anything if the sensor array is... Eleanor stood apart from them and checked the time on her phone. 7:04. The flight to Washington was 2 hours and 20 minutes. The presentation was at 2. If they didn't take off by 9, absolute outer limit, she wouldn't make it. The margin was tightening fast, and the engineers circling the aircraft were starting to look less like people solving a problem and more like people performing the appearance of solving one while running out of ideas. Connor appeared at her shoulder. "Eleanor." His voice was measured, careful. "I want to say something, and I need you to hear it as coming from a place of operational realism, not from any personal agenda." She looked at him. "If we can't get this aircraft in the air by 8:30, there is no commercial flight option that gets you there by 2. The only way the company is represented at that presentation is if someone else goes." "Someone else?" "I know this contract. I've been in every prep meeting. I can deliver the technical Q&A better than anyone on the team because I built the response framework." She studied his face. Connor was good at faces, good at composing them into arrangements that read as reasonable and calm. He had the kind of features that photographed as trustworthy, and she had always privately thought that was an asset she'd never fully trusted. "It's not 8:30 yet," she said. "No, but then let's not have this conversation until it is." She walked back toward the aircraft. The engineers were now crouched beneath the portside engine housing, 2 of them holding flashlights, while a third ran a secondary diagnostic on a handheld unit. The lead maintenance supervisor, a heavy-set man named Garrett, no relation to the pilot, was explaining to his team why the fuel control unit was fine for the 3rd time when Eleanor noticed someone else in the hangar. He was working on the far side of the space, near the rear wall, paying no visible attention to any of them. Medium height, late 30s, maybe 40, with the kind of build that came from physical work rather than a gym, broad through the shoulders, hands that looked used. He was crouched near the base of the hangar's east wall, running a measuring tape along a section of the concrete floor and making marks with a pencil in a small notebook. His jacket had a contractor's badge clipped to the front breast pocket. She walked over. "What are you working on?" He looked up without startling.
People who weren't expecting attention usually startled. He just looked up, calm, like he'd known she was approaching. Section of floors got stress fracturing under the anchor points, he said. Management flagged it for assessment last week. I'm doing the survey. He glanced at the cluster of engineers around the aircraft. Looks like you've got your own problem this morning. How long have you been here? About an hour. He returned to his measuring tape. Came in before the aircraft was towed out. Something in the way he said it made her stop. When the aircraft was towed in, did you see anything? He paused with the tape measure. Didn't look up immediately. A small hesitation, the kind that in Eleanor's experience meant someone was deciding something. What kind of anything? He said. Anything that seemed off. He set down the tape measure and straightened up. He was about 6 feet with dark eyes that moved in a specific way. Methodically, she thought, like someone taking inventory rather than just looking. He glanced at the aircraft again, then at the engineers, then back at her. Your maintenance crew has been working that engine for 40 minutes. Yes. Has anyone looked at where the aircraft was sitting before they moved it? She turned and looked at the space in question, the empty area of hangar floor about 30 feet away, where the Meridian had been parked overnight. It looked exactly like hangar floor. Concrete, slightly oil-stained, unremarkable. Why would they? He didn't answer the question. Instead, he picked up his notebook and pencil and started walking toward the empty floor section. She followed him, which she couldn't entirely explain except that there was something in his manner that didn't perform confidence. It just had it, the kind that didn't need an audience. He crouched near the center of the space and looked at the floor for a long time without touching it. You have chalk? He said. Excuse me? In the maintenance bay. A chalk line reel or a piece of marking chalk. Anything. She looked at Garrett, the supervisor, who had drifted over with an expression suggesting he was watching something vaguely embarrassing happen to someone else. You have chalk? She asked him. Garrett looked like he wanted to say something dismissive. Instead, he sighed and sent one of the junior technicians to the supply rack. The technician came back with a piece of yellow chalk, the fat kind used for surface marking. The contractor took it. He crouched at 3 specific points on the floor and drew a circle around each one. The circles were about 18 inches in diameter, positioned in a rough triangular arrangement. He stood back and looked at them. To Eleanor, they looked like 3 circles drawn on a concrete floor. To the engineers who had gathered around, drawn by the interruption to their own unproductive activity, they looked like the same thing. What exactly are we looking at? Garrett asked. The politeness in his voice was doing a lot of work to cover the contempt underneath it. You've been looking at the engine, the contractor said. But the engine didn't fail. It was told to fail. He pointed at the first circle. This is where the main wheel sat overnight. You can see the compression marks if you get low enough. But more importantly, you can see residue. Fine residue, consistent with a crystalline compound designed to migrate on contact with hydraulic pressure and collect in the vapor pathway of the fuel control system. Silence. The aircraft sat here for how long? He continued. Overnight, Eleanor said. Since yesterday at 6. 14 hours. He nodded like this confirmed something. Not long enough to cause a catastrophic failure on the ground, because the system doesn't pressurize fully until the aircraft is at altitude and the temperature differential triggers vapor expansion. On the ground, the engine just won't start. In the air, he stopped. In the air, you'd have a different conversation. The silence this time had a different quality. Garrett recovered first. That's an extraordinary claim, he said, from someone who was hired to look at concrete. He's right, said one of the younger engineers quickly. I mean, if there's no sabotage mechanism visible in the engine diagnostic, that's exactly the kind of failure pathway that nobody asked you, Garrett said. Eleanor was looking at the contractor. What's your name? Mason Reed? Mason. She looked at the 3 circles on the floor, then at the aircraft, then at her watch. It was 7:31. What do you need to prove this? He thought for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking. Shut down the active diagnostic. Pull the vapor recovery line from the left fuel control housing, not the sensor, the line itself, about 6 inches back from the junction.
Have someone with a clean light look at the interior surface of that line. He paused. And you'll want someone to pull the access logs for this hangar going back 48 hours. Because whoever set this up came in when the aircraft was already here. Eleanor turned to Garrett. Do what he said. Garrett opened his mouth. Do what he said, she said again, quieter this time, which in her experience was always more effective than louder. Garrett did what he said. It took 11 minutes. The engineer who pulled the vapor recovery line, a young woman named Torres who'd been working the airfield for 2 years and had the quiet competence of someone who'd learned to be thorough by watching other people's mistakes, held the section under a work light and went very still. Then she looked up at Eleanor. There's something in here, she said. There's definitely something in here. The hangar got quiet in the specific way that spaces do when everyone in them suddenly understands that the situation is not what they thought it was 6 minutes ago. Mason Reed was already looking at the access log terminal near the hangar's side entrance, his notebook open, the yellow chalk still in his hand. Connor Vale was standing 20 feet away, and Eleanor noticed, she would think about this later, replay it with the particular focus of someone looking for what they should have seen sooner, that he hadn't moved closer to look. Everyone else had moved closer. Connor had stayed exactly where he was, watching. She would think about that for a long time. The morning was still young, and already nothing about it was what she'd expected. Her flight sat grounded on the tarmac with a substance inside its fuel system that hadn't appeared in any diagnostic because it wasn't supposed to appear in any diagnostic until it was too late for the information to be useful. A contract worth nearly $500 million was waiting in Washington in a building she was no longer certain she could reach. And a man hired to measure cracks in a concrete floor had just prevented something she didn't yet have full words for. Eleanor Madison stood in the middle of that hangar, the morning cold still on her coat, the chalk circles brilliant yellow on the gray floor around her, and understood that the day she'd planned, the presentation, the contract, the proof that 6 years of difficult choices had been pointing somewhere worthwhile, had just become something else entirely. She didn't know yet how far down this went. She didn't know yet who she was dealing with or how long this had been in motion. She looked at the 3 circles. Simple marks. Yellow chalk on gray concrete. The kind of thing that a person only notices if they're looking at the right things in the right way at the right time. Mason Reed had been in the hangar for an hour before anyone knew to pay attention to him. The question that was beginning to settle into Eleanor's chest like a cold weight was not about the aircraft anymore. It was about who in that building had known exactly how long he'd been there. The vapor recovery line sat on a steel work table under a portable flood lamp, and 3 people were looking at it like it was evidence at a crime scene, which, Eleanor was beginning to understand, was exactly what it was. Torres had laid it flat on a piece of clean white shop cloth. The residue inside was visible if you angled the light right. A faint crystalline deposit along the interior wall, barely there, the kind of thing that looked like ordinary mineral buildup until you understood what you were actually looking at. Torres knew enough to know she didn't know enough. She'd said so clearly, which Eleanor appreciated more than she would have appreciated false confidence. I can't identify the compound without a lab, Torres said, but it doesn't belong there. Whatever it is, it got introduced after the last service. I can tell you that much. When was the last service? Eleanor asked. 11 days ago. Full systems inspection. I signed off on the fuel control myself. Eleanor looked at the line, then at Torres. And it was clean. It was clean. The statement sat there and did what uncomfortable facts do in quiet rooms. It made everyone calculate what it meant for them personally. Garrett, the maintenance supervisor, had stopped performing skepticism sometime in the last 15 minutes. His face had moved through a visible sequence, dismissal, reluctant attention, and now a careful blankness that Eleanor recognized as a man trying to figure out which version of the next hour was worst for him. He wasn't a bad man, she thought. He was a man who'd been wrong in a way that had consequences, and he was still absorbing it. Mason Reed was not at the work table. He was back at the access terminal near the hangar's side entrance, standing with his notebook open and his pencil moving in slow, deliberate marks. He'd been there for 8 minutes. Eleanor watched him from across the hangar and tried to build a reasonable profile of a person who had come to measure floor stress fractures and ended up preventing what she still couldn't fully articulate aloud, but was beginning to name in her head. She walked over. "The access log," she said. "What are you finding?" He turned the notebook so she could see it. He'd written a column of times in a neat, compressed hand. Not the scrawl of someone writing quickly, but the careful notation of someone used to recording things they might need to prove later. 12 entries in the last 48 hours, he said. 8 of them are your standard crew. Garrett, Torres, the 2 overnight cleaners, Rhonda Garrett for the pre-flight walkthrough this morning. Those all match up with what you'd expect. He put his finger on 4 of the entries. These 4 are keyed to a secondary access credential, not a name, a credential number. Eleanor leaned closer to the screen. The terminal was old, the display slightly washed out under the fluorescent lights. She could see what he was pointing at, entries logged at 11:14 p.m. and 2:39 a.m. 2 nights ago, and then again at 10:58 p.m. and 1:17 a.m. last night. What credential? That's what I can't tell from this terminal. It's a numeric code, but it's the same code both nights, and both nights it appears in a 2-entry pattern, in, then out approximately 40 minutes later. 40 minutes is enough time. If you know what you're doing, 20 is enough time. She straightened up. Her phone showed 7:49. The contract presentation was at 2. Washington was 2 hours and 20 minutes away by air, longer by anything else, and the aircraft on her tarmac had a compromised fuel system. The morning had developed its own momentum now, separate from anything she'd planned for it, and she had the specific feeling she associated with company crises. Not panic, exactly, but a kind of enforced clarity, where everything that wasn't immediately relevant dropped away, and what remained felt very sharp and very cold. Someone with access credentials came into this hangar twice over 2 nights, she said, introduced a compound into the fuel system that wouldn't trigger any diagnostic on the ground but would cause system failure at altitude. That's what the physical evidence suggests. And you found this by looking at the floor. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite anything. I was looking at the floor for a different reason, but yes. She studied him for a moment. There was something she couldn't place in the way he moved through the problem. Methodical, unhurried, with the particular patience of someone who understood that rushing past details was how details became disasters later. She'd hired enough engineers over the years to recognize the difference between competence that performed itself and competence that simply was. Mason Reed didn't seem to be performing anything. "Who sent you?" she said. "For the floor survey." "Hangar operations contracted through Millfield Service Group. I've been doing assessments for this airfield for about 3 years. Do you have a background in aircraft systems?" The pause before his answer was small, but not nothing. "I have some familiarity," he said. It was the kind of careful answer that covered a larger truth, and Eleanor had enough experience with careful answers to file it away rather than push on it. There would be time for that. Right now, there were more urgent things. She turned back toward the main hangar floor, where Garrett was on his phone and Torres was carefully rebagging the vapor recovery line for proper evidence handling. She'd thought of that herself, which Eleanor noted. And Connor Vale was standing near the aircraft stairs, with his arms crossed, watching everything with the attentive stillness of someone waiting for information. She had known Connor for 9 years. She had promoted him, trusted his operational judgment, included him in rooms she didn't include most people in. He was standing 40 feet away, and she could not currently read his face, which was unusual. Connor's face was typically legible to her. That was part of why she'd kept him close. She walked toward him. "The access logs show someone with a secondary credential coming in twice overnight," she said. "Do you know anything about secondary credentials for this hangar?" His expression shifted. Concern, attentive, and appropriate. "Secondary access? That'd be above the standard crew level. Operations management, executive team, maybe contracted security. So people at your level. And yours. And the airfield's own management team." He met her eyes evenly. "Eleanor, I want to say something." "You want to say it? Go ahead." "That man," he gestured subtly toward Mason, "showed up in this hangar as a floor contractor. He has no verified aircraft background, as far as any of us know, and he's currently reviewing your access security logs and making determinations about a potential sabotage event. I'm not saying he's wrong about the fuel line. I'm saying we have no idea who he actually is, and we're letting him move freely through a secure area with an ongoing investigation. It was a reasonable point. Eleanor had thought something close to it herself, a few minutes ago. He's the one who found it, she said. He said he found it. He also had an hour in this hangar before anyone was paying attention to him. She looked at Connor. He held her gaze without blinking. Get the airfield's security director on site, she said, right now, and pull whatever credentialing information Millfield Service Group has on Mason Reed. Connor nodded and moved away with his phone already in hand, and Eleanor stood in the middle of the hangar floor with the yellow chalk circles 5 feet to her left and tried to think clearly about what she actually knew versus what she was being asked to assume. The fuel line was real. The residue was real. The access log entries were real. Those were not in dispute. The question Connor was raising about Mason was legitimate on its face. She knew that. She also knew that Connor was the one who had tried to insert himself into the Washington presentation at 7:04 before anyone had confirmed the aircraft was definitively grounded, which was a small thing that had lodged itself somewhere in the back of her thinking like a splinter. She went back to Mason. I need to ask you something directly, she said. Okay. My COO is about to request your credentials and background from the company that sent you. Is there anything in that information I should know about before it comes up? He looked at her with the flat, unconcerned expression of someone who'd anticipated the question. My name is Mason Reed. I'm licensed as a structural assessment contractor through Millfield. Before that, I worked in aircraft systems analysis for 11 years, the last 4 at a company called Veriton Aerospace. He paused. Veriton had a component failure event 8 years ago. I flagged the failure mode in advance through the internal safety reporting system. The report was dismissed. The failure happened. 3 aircraft were grounded and the company lost a government contract. Veriton blamed the failure on a documentation error in my division, which was not accurate, and I was let go as part of the restructuring. He said all of it in the same tone he'd used to describe the vapor recovery line. Not defensive, not rehearsed, just factual, in the way of someone who'd had 8 years to stop being angry about it and hadn't entirely managed. You were pushed out, Eleanor said. I was a convenient explanation. And then you stopped working in aircraft systems. Yes. Why are you telling me this now? Because you asked me something directly, he said, and I figured that deserved a direct answer. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and looked at the chalk circles, the yellow marks bright and strange on the gray concrete, and thought about the fact that this man had come into her hangar to look at floor cracks and had spent the last hour preventing something she still couldn't fully bring herself to name. The compound in the fuel system, she said. What happens at altitude? Walk me through it. He thought for a second, gathering the technical into language that would land, and then said, the fuel control vapor pathway manages the mixture ratio under pressure differentials. At cruising altitude, the differential increases and the vapor pathway activates more intensively. The compound you've got in that line is, based on what Torres described, consistent with a class of crystalline valve disruptors that don't fully activate under ground level pressure. They behave like residue. But at altitude, in the right temperature range, they migrate through the pathway and collect at the primary valve junction. The valve sticks. The mixture goes wrong. You get combustion instability. Meaning the engine fails. Meaning the engine fails in a way that's almost impossible to attribute to anything other than a mechanical failure after the fact, because the compound degrades rapidly above a certain temperature. He paused. If that aircraft had taken off this morning and made it to cruising altitude, the investigation would have found a valve malfunction and a fuel system anomaly. Nothing that pointed here. The word investigation, and what it implied about the investigators and the absence of anyone to investigate, sat between them for a moment. That's not a prank, Eleanor said. No? That's not someone trying to delay my meeting. No, he said again. It isn't. She'd known it since Torres said there's definitely something in here, but hearing it said flatly, without cushioning, made it land differently in her chest. Someone had come into her hangar on 2 consecutive nights, and built a mechanism designed to fail at 35,000 feet, not to ground the aircraft, to bring it down. She breathed carefully and kept her face from doing what it wanted to do. "All right," she said. "The security director is coming. I need you to stay on site and walk through everything you found with them. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Is there anything else you've noticed that we haven't talked about yet?" He opened his notebook to a page near the back. He'd sketched a rough diagram of the hangar floor, the parking position, the 3 chalk circles, the access terminal, and the aircraft stairs. He'd added a detail she hadn't mentioned. "The stairs," he said, pointing to his sketch. "The aircraft stairs were already positioned when I came in this morning, before Rhonda Garrett arrived for pre-flight, before your ground crew came in." He looked at her. "Someone accessed this hangar overnight, positioned the boarding stairs, and left. Ground crew assumed Rhonda had done it. Rhonda assumed ground crew had done it. Nobody did it, except whoever was in here at 2:39 in the morning." Eleanor looked at his sketch. The detail was small, the kind of small detail that was invisible unless you'd been in the hangar long enough to see what was normal and what wasn't, which required time and observation, not expertise or credentials. "You noticed that when you came in," she said. "I noticed things," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was just accurate. By 8:15, the airfield security director, a compact, serious woman named Bales, who arrived in her own car and clearly hadn't been sleeping well before the call came, was on site and moving through the evidence in the methodical way of someone who'd done real investigations before and knew what useful information looked like versus what looked useful but wasn't. Mason walked her through the chalk circles, the access log, the stair position, the vapor recovery line. He explained everything in the same steady, unfussy way he'd explained it to Eleanor, and Bales listened without interrupting, which was how Eleanor knew she was taking it seriously. Torres had photographed everything and secured the fuel line segment. The access log entries had been flagged, and a formal digital preservation request was in process. The hangar had been closed to non-essential personnel. Connor Vale had made 4 phone calls in the last 30 minutes, and Eleanor had not been close enough to hear any of them. She stood near the hangar door with her cold coffee and her Washington presentation still waiting in her tablet bag, and tried to think through the shape of what was happening. Not just the immediate facts, the compound, the access entries, the stage stairs, but the larger shape, the intent, the planning involved. This required someone who knew her schedule, who knew when the aircraft would be parked overnight, how long it would be sitting when the ground crew typically arrived. Who understood enough about fuel system engineering to know exactly which compound to use and exactly where to introduce it so it would appear in no ground diagnostic. That description did not fit many people. It fit, in fact, a fairly short list. She was still working through that list when Connor came and stood beside her. Millfield confirmed his credentials, he said. He's licensed, clean record, been with them 3 years. And before that, a small pause. Veritin Aerospace, systems analyst, let go during a restructuring 8 years ago. He told me. Connor looked at her. He told you. Before I asked Millfield, he told me voluntarily. Something moved in Connor's expression. Slight, controlled, the kind of adjustment that was too small to call a reaction and too deliberate to call nothing. That doesn't clear him, Connor said. Getting out ahead of a background check is a strategy, Eleanor. It doesn't mean, I know what it can mean, she said. I also know what physical evidence means. She looked at the chalk circles still bright on the hangar floor and at Mason Reed standing 30 feet away, answering Bales's questions with the same patience he'd given everything else this morning. Someone came into this hangar at 2:39 in the morning, she said. The compound in that fuel line is real. The access entries are real. Someone knew my schedule and my aircraft and my fuel system well enough to build a mechanism that wouldn't appear in any diagnostic until I was somewhere above Pennsylvania. She turned to Connor. I'm not going to spend the next hour arguing about whether Mason Reed is credible when the evidence he found is sitting on a work table 60 feet from where we're standing. Connor's jaw was set in the careful way of someone maintaining composure because the alternative was visible. The Washington meeting, he said. It's 9:15. What's the call? She thought about the contract, about the 11 weeks of preparation and the technical Q&A she'd reviewed on the plane and hadn't finished reading, about her father's company and what it meant that someone had gone this far to make sure she didn't land at the other end. Get me a secure video conference line to the Harwick team, she said. I'm going to call them directly and explain that we have an active security situation at our operations facility and request a 48-hour postponement. I'll send them documentation. They might not grant it. They might not, but I'm not leaving this site while there's an open investigation into an attempt to bring down my aircraft. She said it flatly, without drama. And I'm not sending someone else in my place. She looked at him when she said that last part. Connor held her gaze for a moment, then looked away first. At 9:40, Bales pulled the secondary credential number from the airfield's master access database and matched it to an identity. And the name she showed Eleanor on her tablet screen was one that Eleanor had to read twice before her mind would accept it as the answer to the question she'd been asking all morning. She stood in the hangar with Bales's tablet in her hands and the yellow chalk circles behind her and the grounded aircraft beyond that, and understood that she had been wrong about something she'd trusted for 9 years. The question now was not whether. The question was how far it went, and who else was involved, and whether the Harwick contract was the only thing at stake here, or just the most visible piece of something considerably larger. Mason Reed was watching her from across the hangar, not intrusively, just present, the way he'd been present all morning, quiet and attentive and there, in the specific way of someone who understood that a situation wasn't finished simply because the first truth had been found. There was more. There was almost always more. The name on Bales's tablet was Connor Vale, not a credential assigned to someone beneath him, not a shared access code passed through a chain of administrative convenience. His name, his individual access credential, issued 18 months ago when Connor had requested expanded operational permissions for what he'd described in the internal request as executive oversight of contracted aircraft services. The request had been approved in 40 minutes by the airfield's then operations manager, who had since retired and was currently living in Scottsdale, and probably had no idea his approval signature was now attached to something considerably more serious than routine executive access. Eleanor handed the tablet back to Bales without saying anything. Bales waited. "Where is he right now?" Eleanor asked. "Near the south entrance," Bales said. "He's been on his phone. My assistant is watching him." "Don't approach him yet." Eleanor thought for a moment. "What do you need to make the access log evidence airtight?" "I need the master system to generate a certified timestamp report. That takes about 20 minutes through the airfield's admin office. And I need someone to confirm the credential was not shared or delegated. If he claims he gave the code to someone else, we need to be able to show that's inconsistent with how the system works. Can you show that?" The system logs biometric confirmation alongside credential entry for secondary access. Thumb scan. Bales met her eyes. It's his thumb. Eleanor absorbed that in the specific way of someone who already knew the answer to a question but needed to hear it stated plainly before the next decision could be made. 20 minutes for the timestamp report, she said. Get it started. Don't tell him. Bales moved away. Eleanor stood where she was and looked at the south entrance, where Connor was pacing slowly near the wall with his phone at his ear, his back partially turned. From this distance, in this light, he looked exactly like what she had believed him to be for 9 years. Competent, careful, the kind of man who managed complexity so that other people didn't have to. She had trusted that picture. She had built operational decisions around it. The picture was still intact, physically. The man was the same height, the same careful posture, the same well-cut jacket he'd been wearing when he handed her a coffee at 6:15 this morning. Everything visible was unchanged. Everything visible had always been the point. She walked to Mason, who was reviewing his notebook near the work table where the fuel line still sat in its evidence bag. "The secondary credential belongs to my COO," she said. He didn't look surprised. He looked like someone who had arrived at the same conclusion by a different route and had been waiting to see how long it took the evidence to get there officially. "His thumb scan is in the system," she said. "He was here at 11:14 and 2:39 2 nights ago, and 10:58 and 1:17 last night." 4 entries, Mason said. 2 nights. The first night was probably reconnaissance, learning where everything sat, how long he had, whether the compound needed to be introduced in stages or all at once. And the second night was the installation. Yes. Mason set down his notebook. He looked across the hangar at Connor's distant figure and said nothing for a moment. "What are you going to do?" he asked. It It was a simple question, and she didn't have a clean answer for it. What she had were instincts, most of them pulling in slightly different directions. The instinct to confront him directly, which was the one she trusted least because it was the one that felt most satisfying. The instinct to call her company's legal counsel immediately, which was the correct professional response, and she'd already mentally composed the first two sentences of that call. And underneath both of those, quieter and more unsettling, the instinct that she didn't yet understand the full shape of what Connor had been trying to accomplish, because this level of planning, this level of risk, did not happen in service of a small ambition. "I need to understand what he was actually after," she said. "Delaying the Washington presentation is not enough motive for this. Grounding me is not enough." "No," Mason agreed. "It isn't. If I'm dead and the aircraft goes down, what happens to Madison Arrows?" She asked it factually, as a structural question, not as a statement of vulnerability. Mason seemed to receive it that way. "Emergency succession," he said. "Who's in the succession plan?" "The board appoints an interim CEO pending a shareholder vote. The COO traditionally serves in an acting capacity during the transition." She paused. "Connor, and if the company enters a period of instability, leadership vacuum, investigation, a crashed aircraft connected to the brand, company value drops, potentially sharply. Shareholder positions that bet on a decline would profit." She looked at him. "You're describing a short position." "I'm describing a motive," he said. "I don't know if that's what it is, but it fits." She pulled her phone out and called her in-house financial analyst, a meticulous young man named Park, who worked from a home office in Oak Park, and answered on the second ring regardless of the hour because he was the kind of person who slept lightly and kept his phone on the nightstand. "Park, I need you to look at something urgently. Any unusual short positions against Madison Arrows stock in the last 90 days. Anything that would pay out significantly on a drop in company value. Puts, short contracts. Anything that looks like a bet against us. Focus on positions opened in the last 3 months and any counterparties connected to the Valden Group." She added the Valden Group because it was the name that had been hovering at the edge of her thinking since she'd understood the size of what Connor might have been attempting. Valden was a private equity and acquisitions firm that had expressed unsolicited interest in Madison Arrows twice in the past 4 years. Interest she had declined both times, clearly and finally. Their most recent approach, 8 months ago, had included a valuation she considered insultingly low and a timeline that suggested they expected her position to weaken before they moved again. Park said he'd have preliminary information in 30 minutes. She hung up and looked at her watch. It was 10:08. In the 54 minutes since she'd understood the credential belonged to Connor, she had made 3 decisions and started 4 processes moving. That was about the pace she could maintain. The problem with crises was that they demanded speed at exactly the moment that the cost of moving too fast was highest. She needed the timestamp report. She needed Park's financial analysis. She needed Bales to have enough to bring in the appropriate authorities without the case being challengeable on procedural grounds. And she needed Connor to not know that any of this was in motion, which meant she needed to go talk to him. She crossed the hangar floor with the deliberate pace of someone who had decided something, which was accurate, though what she had decided was simply to behave normally until she had enough to act on. Connor saw her coming and lowered his phone with an expression that she now examined more carefully than she would have 4 hours ago. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of an early morning, but something deeper, the kind that came from sustained tension over time. She filed that away. "Harwick responded," he said. "They're willing to postpone to Friday. Sent a formal acknowledgement 5 minutes ago." "That's good. It's not ideal, but it keeps the door open." He watched her face. "You look like you've made a decision." "Several," she said. "Bales is working through the access log formally. It'll take a few hours to generate the full report." She kept her voice flat and informational. "Until then, I want everyone who had airfield access in the last 72 hours to stay on site and available. Can you coordinate that with Bales' assistant?" It was a task that required him to stay in the hangar and engage with a person who was, at this moment, building a case against him. She watched him process it. "Of course," he said. I also need you to flag anything from your operational oversight of the contracted services in the last 6 months. Any anomalies, any access requests that seemed unusual. Bales will want to review everything. I'll put together a summary. Tonight, if possible. He nodded, and she left him to it, and the thing she felt walking back across the hangar floor was not satisfaction. It was the specific discomfort of someone who had just looked at 9 years of professional history and understood that at least some portion of it had been constructed for her benefit rather than built in good faith. She didn't know how much. That was the part she hadn't yet located. The timestamp report came through at 10:31. Bales printed it in the airfield's admin office and brought it to Eleanor in a manila folder, the old-fashioned way, which Eleanor appreciated because paper was harder to intercept than a digital message on a network that Connor Vale had administrative access to. The report was 12 pages. Bales had flagged the relevant entries in yellow. 4 access events. Connor's biometric credential. Times that placed him in the hangar while his public calendar, Eleanor had asked Park to pull it before she'd redirected him to the financial analysis. Showed him at home or in transit. No witnesses. No secondary personnel entries during any of the 4 windows. This is enough for law enforcement contact, Bales said. In my professional assessment, I want to be clear that it's your decision, and there may be reasons you want to handle this through other channels first. But the physical evidence combined with the access documentation it's a complete package. Is anything challengeable? His counsel will argue the credential could have been compromised without his knowledge, that the thumb scan was somehow spoofed or the system has an error. Those arguments exist. Bales paused. But the compound is in your fuel line, and his thumb opened this hangar 4 times in 48 hours. It'll take a creative defense. Eleanor set down the folder and looked through the hangar's small side window at the tarmac where her aircraft sat in the flat morning light, grounded and improbable in the way of an expensive thing that had almost become something terrible. There's a financial angle I'm still waiting on information about, she said. I want to understand the full scope before I make the call to law enforcement. Can you give me another hour? I can give you whatever you need. I'd ask that we don't let him leave the property. He's not going anywhere, Eleanor said. He thinks he's putting together a summary for your review. Bales allowed herself a very small expression that wasn't quite a smile. Park called at 11:04. His voice had the specific quality it got when he'd found something significant and was managing his own reaction to it. Slightly compressed, professionally careful, the verbal equivalent of someone carrying something fragile. I found positions, he said, significant ones. Put options on Madison Arrows opened 63 days ago, 12 days after the Harwick finalist announcement. The total value represents a bet on a 40 to 60% drop in share price, which is the kind of drop you'd associate with a catastrophic event, a grounded fleet, a major safety failure, a death in executive leadership. She kept her voice level. Counterparty? The positions are held through 3 shell entities, but 2 of them resolved to a holding company registered in Delaware that was capitalized 8 months ago. He paused. The capitalization investors include a venture vehicle associated with the Valden Group and 1 individual investor whose name appears as a limited partner. He read her the name. She stood in the airfield's administrative corridor, holding her phone, and let the name settle into the structure of everything she'd been building since 7:04 this morning. Connor Vale, listed as a limited partner in a financial vehicle that would profit enormously from a catastrophic drop in Madison Aero's stock, a drop that would be triggered by the death of its CEO and the subsequent leadership vacuum, combined with a high-profile safety incident tied to the company's own aircraft. It was not complicated in the end. The mechanism was sophisticated. The motive was not money and the particular greed of someone who had decided that the most direct route to what he wanted was to remove the person standing between him and it. Park, she said, I need you to preserve everything you found. Screenshots, source documentation, timestamps. Send it to my personal encrypted account, not the company server. And don't talk to anyone about this. Understood? A pause. Eleanor, are you okay? She considered the question honestly. I'm working on it, she said, which was the truest thing she could have said, and hung up. She found Mason near the chalk circles, which no one had disturbed. He was crouched near the first one, looking at the floor again with the quality of attention she'd noticed in him all morning. Not searching for anything new, she thought, but simply not willing to stop looking until he was certain he'd seen everything. The financial piece is confirmed, she said. Short positions against Madison Aeros opened 63 days ago, held through entities connected to the Valden Group and Connor Vale personally. Mason stood. Valden, he said. You know them? I know their acquisition history. They've taken positions in 3 aerospace companies in the last decade through similar methods: manufactured instability, leadership transitions under pressure, below-value acquisitions during the chaos. He said it without particular emotion. They're patient. They set things up months in advance. Connor was their inside position. He's been here 9 years, Mason said. Long enough to be trusted with everything. Long enough to understand exactly how to move inside the company without attracting attention. He looked at her. How long has Valden been approaching you? 4 years? 2 formal offers, both declined. The second one was 8 months ago, and 63 days ago. The Harwick announcement made it public that we were a finalist. A successful contract of that size would raise our value significantly, make a below-market acquisition impossible. She understood the timeline now, fully and clearly. If I land the Harwick contract, Valden can't touch us, so they moved before I could. Through Connor. Through Connor. She stood there for a moment with all of it assembled in front of her. The chalk circles, the fuel line, the access logs, the financial positions, the 9 years of a professional relationship that had been, at least in part, a long and patient bet against her. What she felt was not what she might have predicted. Not rage, exactly. That would come later, she suspected, in quieter circumstances when there was space for it. What she felt right now was a cold, settled clarity, the kind that came when a situation stopped being uncertain and became instead a problem with defined edges and addressable dimensions. She knew what she needed to do. She pulled out her phone and called her corporate attorney, a sharp-edged woman named Carver, who had a voice like someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior a long time ago and was therefore never caught off guard by it. I need you and a federal contact on the phone in 30 minutes, Eleanor said. I have physical evidence, access documentation, and financial records tied to an attempt on my life and a coordinated plan to destabilize and acquire my company. I'll send you everything in the next 10 minutes. Carver said, I'm clearing my morning. And that was the whole conversation. Eleanor hung up and looked at Mason. I'm going to need you to walk through everything again with my attorney and a federal investigator. The chalk circles, the access log, the compound, everything you observed this morning from the time you arrived. All right? They're going to ask about your background, about Veritan. I know. Is there anything in that history that Connor Vale's attorneys could use to argue your observations are motivated by something other than what they are? He considered it with the same honesty he'd brought to every question she'd asked him today. They'll try, he said. Someone who got pushed out of the industry has a possible grudge against large aerospace companies and their executives. That narrative exists, and they'll reach for it. But my notebook has been open since I walked in this morning. Every observation I made, every time I made it, in the sequence I made it, before I knew whose aircraft it was, before I knew who owned what credential, before any of this turned into what it turned into. He held up the notebook. I wrote down the stair position at 6:12. I drew the first circle diagram at 7:18. I noted the vapor line observation at 7:44. Everything I did today is time-stamped in my own hand, and none of it required me to know anything about Connor Vale. She looked at the notebook, worn cover, pages thick with compression from the pencil. It looked like something he carried everywhere, which she suspected he did. Okay, she said. Then Connor's voice came from across the hangar, raised slightly, not shouting, but loud enough that both Eleanor and Mason turned. He was looking at Bales's assistant, who had clearly just said something. Connor's expression had shifted into something Eleanor had never seen on him before, in 9 years. The specific look of a person whose calculation has just revealed that the situation is no longer what they believed it to be. He looked across the hangar and found Eleanor's eyes. The distance between them was 30 feet. The air in the hangar was cold and flat and bright under the fluorescent lights. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Connor did the thing that answered the last question she'd had about him. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to explain or deflect or reach for a reasonable story. He turned toward the south entrance. "Bales!" Eleanor said, loudly enough to carry. Bales was already moving. It took 3 minutes and was considerably less dramatic than it might have been. No running, no confrontation, just Bales and her assistant positioned between Connor and the exit, and Connor stopping when he understood that the math no longer worked in his favor. He stood near the south wall with his hands at his sides and his face doing something complicated and unsuccessful. And Eleanor walked toward him across the hangar floor, past the chalk circles, past the grounded aircraft, until she was standing 8 feet away. She didn't have a speech prepared. She hadn't been planning this moment long enough to prepare one. She just looked at him for a second, this man she had trusted with the operational core of her father's company, and said the only thing that seemed worth saying. 9 years, Connor. He said nothing. The compound is already in evidence, she said. The access log is certified. The financial positions are documented. She kept her voice level. Not cold exactly, just flat, in the way of someone who has moved past a feeling into the territory that comes after it. My attorney is going to walk through every piece of it with a federal investigator this afternoon. You should call your own counsel. He looked at her then, really looked, for the first time since she'd arrived at the airfield this morning. And what was in his face was not defiance or manufactured innocence. It was something smaller and more human than either of those things. It was already in motion, he said, before you came on board. Valden approached me when Raymond was still running things. They said the company's trajectory was unsustainable, that it was going to fail anyway, and they were offering a managed transition. Don't, she said. I'm not asking you to. I said don't. He stopped. She studied him for another moment. Then she stepped back, and Bales moved in, and that was the end of that conversation. Eleanor turned and walked back toward the center of the hangar. The chalk circles were still there, yellow and clear on the gray concrete. Mason Reed was standing a few feet away from them with his notebook closed in his hand, watching her with the quiet attention of someone present enough to see that this moment required nothing from him except to let it be what it was. She looked at the 3 circles. She thought about the fact that they'd been drawn in 7 minutes by a man no one had been paying attention to, on a floor that had nothing to do with aircraft systems, using a piece of chalk borrowed from a supervisor who'd handed it over, mostly to prove that the request was pointless. Simple marks. And every piece of what she now held, the evidence, the timeline, the exposed betrayal, her own life still intact and standing in this hangar, traced back to those marks and to the man who'd made them. The federal investigators would arrive in 2 hours. Her attorney was already reviewing documents. The Harwick presentation had been rescheduled to Friday. There was an enormous amount of work left to do. She knew that. She was already organizing it in her head, already mapping the sequence of what needed to happen and in what order, because that was how she was built. Crisis as a problem to be worked through rather than a weight to be carried. But she stood still for a moment longer, in the middle of the hangar, with the grounded aircraft and the chalk circles and the cold morning light, and let herself understand what this morning had actually been. Not a delay, not a setback. The day someone tried to end everything she'd built, and failed, because an unnoticed man with a pencil and a notebook had been paying attention to the right things. The federal investigators arrived at 12:47 in 2 unmarked sedans that parked with the specific neatness of people who had done this enough times to know that how you arrived said something about how seriously you were taking the situation. There were 3 of them. The lead was a woman named Okafor, late 40s, unhurried manner, the kind of face that gave nothing away without seeming deliberately closed. She shook Eleanor's hand and looked around the hangar once, taking it in without asking anything yet, which Eleanor recognized as the behavior of someone who preferred to form their own impressions before other people's words started shaping them. The second investigator was younger, a man named Caruso, who carried the evidence kit and said very little. The third was a financial crime specialist named Holt, who had driven separately and arrived with a laptop already open. Carver, Eleanor's attorney, had been on site since 11:30. She was a small, precise woman in her 60s who had the energy of someone 30 years younger and a reputation for making opposing counsel feel they had prepared inadequately, which they usually had. She'd reviewed Park's financial documentation on her tablet in the airfield's break room, and had emerged with the specific expression she wore when evidence was strong enough to make her professionally cheerful. "The physical evidence first," Okafor said. It was not a question. Eleanor walked her through the hangar, the chalk circles, the access terminal, the work table with the evidence-bagged fuel line. Torres was still on site and walked Okafor through her findings with the careful precision of someone who understood she was now part of a federal record. Bales presented the certified timestamp report and the biometric confirmation documentation. Okafor listened to all of it without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, all of them specific, none of them the kind that were actually looking for information, so much as testing the consistency of what she'd already been told. Then she said, "Where's the man who first identified the compound?" Mason had been waiting in the airfield's small crew lounge, a room with 4 chairs, a coffee maker that had seen better years, and a window that looked out at a taxiway. He'd been there for 40 minutes and had apparently spent the time reviewing his notebook, because when Eleanor brought Okafor in, the notebook was on the table, open to the page with the hangar diagram he'd drawn at 718. He stood when they came in. Okafor looked at him the way she'd looked at the hangar. Once, taking inventory. "Mason Reed," she said. "Yes." "You're the floor contractor." "That's what I was hired for this morning, yes." She sat down across from him without being invited, which was simply how she moved through spaces. "Walk me through it from the beginning, from when you arrived." He did. Eleanor had heard it 3 times now. Once when he'd explained it to her. Once when he'd walked Bales through it. Once when he'd repeated it for Carver. And what she noticed each time was that it didn't change. Not in the way that rehearsed stories didn't change because they'd been memorized, but in the way that accurate accounts didn't change because they were rooted in actual sequence. The details were always in the same order. The times were consistent. The language was spare and specific and not trying to be anything other than what it was. Okafor let him finish without interrupting. Then she said, "You have a background in aircraft systems." "I did. I left the industry 8 years ago. Veriton Aerospace." "Yes." "You want to tell me about that?" He leaned back slightly in his chair, not defensively, adjusting to a longer conversation. Veriton had a fuel vapor management system on their mid-range fleet that had a design flaw in the pressure calibration. Under specific altitude and temperature conditions, the calibration would drift outside safe parameters. I documented it through the internal safety reporting process in detail, test data, projected failure models, recommended modifications. The report went to the division director and then, as far as I could tell, stopped moving. What happened? 6 months later, 3 aircraft had to be emergency grounded due to engine anomalies consistent with what I'd documented. No fatalities, but it was close on 2 of them. He said it evenly, without the particular bitterness that Eleanor might have expected. Not because he wasn't bitter, she suspected he was, in the deep and settled way that old injuries become part of the landscape, but because he'd learned how to carry it without wearing it visibly. The company needed an explanation that didn't require them to acknowledge they'd ignored a safety report. My division was identified as the source of a documentation error. I was let go as part of the remediation. Were you the documentation error? No. Can you prove that? The original report is still in existence. I kept copies. It's dated, time-stamped, and routed through the internal system, which means there's a server record of it being received by the division director's office, even if they claimed it never arrived. He paused. I've had 8 years to think about what I'd do if that conversation ever came up again. Okafor looked at him for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than most. Connor Vale's attorney contacted our office 40 minutes ago, she said. Eleanor had not known this. She kept her face still. He's claiming that Mason Reed approached him 3 weeks ago with a proposal, Okafor continued. According to Vale's attorney, Reed offered to arrange a technical disruption to the Madison Aeros aircraft in exchange for a financial payment. Vale claims he refused, and that Reed proceeded independently, and that the sabotage is Reed's work, not his. The room was quiet. Mason's expression didn't change, which was either composure or the specific stillness of someone who has just heard exactly what they expected to hear and is not surprised by it. That's not what happened, he said. I know, Okafor said. Walk me through why. My notebook. He turned it to face her, open to the first entry from this morning. I logged my arrival at 6:09 a.m. I logged the presence of the aircraft at 6:11. I logged the stair position anomaly at 6:12. I noted the engineering team's activity beginning at approximately 6:40 based on when I heard them, and I drew my first observational diagram at 7:18 before I had spoken to anyone other than Ms. Madison. He turned several pages forward. Every observation I made this morning is in sequence, in my handwriting, with times that can be cross-referenced against the hangar's interior security camera footage, which Bales has already confirmed exists for this morning's period. The security footage. The hangar has 2 interior cameras on the east and west walls. They're not high resolution, but they log continuous time-stamped footage. You'll be able to see me arrive, see where I was working, see when I moved toward the aircraft area, and see the sequence of everything I did. None of it will be consistent with someone who pre-planned a sabotage event and was executing a cover story. Okafor was looking at him steadily. And your contact with Vale prior to today? I have never spoken to Connor Vale. I did not know his name until this morning. I did not know this was Eleanor Madison's aircraft when I came in. I knew it was a private aircraft registered to a corporate entity, which is standard for this airfield. The specific identity of the owner was not information I had. Can you verify that? My work assignment came through Millfield's dispatch system. The work order lists the hangar number and the scope of the floor assessment. No aircraft registration, no owner name, no connection to Madison Aero specifically. He held up his phone. The dispatch notification is still in my messages, received yesterday at 4:22 p.m. Okafor looked at it. She looked at it long enough to read it fully, then handed the phone back. I'm going to need the notebook, she said, and I'll need you available for the next several days. Both of those are fine. She stood. The camera footage will either corroborate or contradict his statement about the 3-week contact. If it contradicts, it will, Mason said. She looked at him once more. You sound confident. I'm confident because I know what I did and didn't do, he said. I understand that's not the same as proof, but I've been in a room where what I knew was true didn't matter because the proof was inconvenient for the people who held it. I kept documentation this time. I've kept documentation of everything for 8 years because I learned the hard way what happens when you don't. Okafor left the room. Eleanor stayed. She sat down across from Mason in the chair Okafor had vacated, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The coffee maker near the window made a sound like it was considering attempting to work and then deciding against it. He's going to try to make this about you, she said. Yes. His attorney moved fast. 40 minutes. That means he made that call before Bales's assistant approached him. He was already prepared with an alternate narrative, which means he had one ready in advance, in case something went wrong, meaning in case the aircraft was found before it took off. She thought about that. He assumed the most likely failure point was the compound being discovered during a routine check, not by a floor contractor drawing circles in chalk. I was probably not in his contingency planning. No, she said. I don't imagine you were. She looked at his notebook, which Okafor had taken, but which she could still see clearly in her mind. The neat columns of times, the careful hangar diagram, 8 years of a man who had learned to document everything because once, when it mattered most, he hadn't had proof of something true. You've been carrying copies of that Veritan report for 8 years. Digital copies, 3 separate backups. Waiting. Not waiting, he said, with a slight correction that she understood was important to him. Not expecting, but prepared. There's a difference. She nodded. She understood the difference better than she might have 24 hours ago. The camera footage will clear you, she said, but Connor's attorney is going to take whatever time they can to muddy it. They'll question the notebook's integrity, question the dispatch record, find every soft edge in the timeline and push on it. She watched his face. Are you ready for that? I've been ready for that kind of thing for 8 years, he said. It's not pleasant, but it's survivable. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't entirely let herself do in the middle of the morning's chaos, and thought about what it cost a person to carry a true story that nobody had wanted to hear for 8 years in a field they'd been forced out of,
and still show up to a hangar floor assessment with a pencil and a notebook and enough professional care to notice things that weren't their job to notice. "How's your daughter?" she said. He looked briefly surprised. "Bales's background check was thorough," she said. "Single father, daughter in 3rd grade. "She's good." Something in his face shifted into a register that was entirely different from every other expression he'd worn today. Simpler, warmer, less defended. "She's 8. She thinks I fix floors for a living." "What do you tell her about it?" "I tell her that floors matter, that everything stands on something." He said it with the slight self-consciousness of someone quoting themselves from a conversation with an 8-year-old, aware it sounded more philosophical out loud than it had in context. "She's mostly interested in whether I remembered to buy cereal." Eleanor almost smiled. It happened quickly and not entirely at her direction. "Does she know you used to work in aircraft systems?" "She knows I used to work with planes. She asked me once why I stopped, and I told her the job changed and it was time to do something different." He paused, "which is mostly true." "Will you tell her what happened today?" He thought about it genuinely, not as a rhetorical question. "Someday," he said. "When she's old enough to understand that the version of the story where you do the right thing and it still gets complicated for a while is a more useful story than the version where you do the right thing and everything immediately gets better." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Then her phone rang. It was Carver. She stepped into the corridor and Carver said, in the clipped, efficient way of someone who had organized information into its most essential form, "Holt has traced the Delaware Holding Company. The capitalization funds came from 2 sources, Valden's venture vehicle, which we expected, and a personal account belonging to a director at Valden named Mercer. Here's the piece you need. Mercer and Vail have a documented personal relationship going back 17 years, college. They're in photographs together at industry events as recently as last spring." "So Valden didn't just use Connor as a convenient inside contact," Eleanor said. "They had a relationship with him before he was even at Madison Aeros, predating his hire by 8 years, which means the question of whether Raymond Madison knew what he was bringing into the company is now something the investigators are going to want to answer." Eleanor leaned against the corridor wall. The fluorescent light above her hummed slightly, the low, chronic hum of institutional lighting that she had stopped noticing years ago and now found oddly centering. "My father brought Connor on board," she said. "Yes, I don't know what that means yet. I wanted to tell you before the investigators pieced it together themselves." She thanked Carver and hung up. She stood in the corridor for a moment, alone, and let the question about her father sit in her chest. She did not know the answer.
Raymond Madison had been a good man, imperfect, difficult in the specific way that founders were difficult, occasionally wrong in the way that confident people were occasionally wrong in ways they couldn't see from the inside. He had built something real and handed it to her, and she had always assumed the handing over had been clean. Maybe it had. Maybe Connor had been genuinely unremarkable when Raymond hired him, and Valden had found him later, had cultivated the relationship into something operational after Eleanor had taken the company in a direction that made acquisition more difficult. Maybe her father's judgment had not failed in the way it would feel like it had failed if she let herself go down that road. She didn't know. She might never know completely. She went back into the crew lounge. Mason looked at her face and said, "Something else. There's a longer relationship between Connor and the Valden director than we knew about. It predates his time at Madison Aeros. The investigators will be looking at how and why he was originally hired." Mason absorbed this without reaction. "My father brought him on," she said. "I know. Bales mentioned it. It doesn't change the evidence. No. But it changes some of the questions." He nodded. "It usually works that way. You pull one thread and what's underneath is more complicated than you expected. Not necessarily darker, just more complicated." She sat back down. The room was small and not comfortable, and neither of them were pretending otherwise, which she appreciated. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, not helpfully." "All right. When you were at Veriton, when they dismissed your report and the failures happened, and they blamed your division, did you ever consider going back, filing formally, pressing the case, pushing until someone had to listen?" He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, actually thinking about it. "Yes," he said. "For about 2 years I thought about almost nothing else. I had the documentation. I knew what the record showed. I had colleagues who knew the truth, but were afraid to say it publicly. He stopped. I'm not good at letting things go. I'm not built that way. So walking away from it felt like a kind of failure that I wore for a long time. Why did you walk away? Because my daughter was 4 and her mother had left, and I was spending every hour I wasn't sleeping on a case that was making me someone I didn't want her to know. He said it simply, without performing the sacrifice. Not a clean choice. I gave something up, but the thing I kept mattered more. Eleanor looked at him. You're going to have to testify, she said. Formally. It'll be public record. Your name, the Veritan history, all of it. I know. Connor's attorney will use Veritan to paint a picture of someone with a professional grievance against aviation leadership. I know that too. And my notebook has 47 pages of observations made before I knew who owned the aircraft, who Connor Vail was, or that any of this was connected to anything other than a floor crack assessment. He held her gaze steadily. The notebook is the argument, not me. She thought about that, about the difference between a person's character being the evidence and a person's documented record being the evidence, and why the second one was more durable than the first. Okafor said the interior camera footage is being pulled, she said. It'll show what it shows. It'll show you arriving at 6:09, working in the corner, moving to the aircraft area only after the engineers were already there, drawing the circles, every step in sequence, and none of it coordinated with anything except your own observation. Yes, Connor's narrative collapses the moment they review it. Probably. Defense attorneys don't stop working when the first narrative collapses. But yes, the camera and the notebook together are a complete account. There's no version of the footage that's consistent with a man who pre-planned this. She stood because there was more to do and the afternoon was moving, and she had learned over years of running a company that the specific comfort of sitting in a room and understanding something was a comfort that had to be earned and then released. Understanding was not the end of anything. It was just the beginning of knowing what to do next. I'm going to call my board chair, she said. Before this becomes public, the board needs to hear it from me, directly and completely, including the parts that make us look vulnerable. She looked at Mason. One of the things I've observed about people who try to hide damage is that the hiding is always more expensive than the damage. Connor bet on my willingness to protect the company's image above the truth. He was wrong about that. Were you ever tempted? It was a fair question, and she gave it the honesty it deserved. For about 4 minutes, she said, around 10:15. I thought about the Harwick evaluators, and the board, and the press cycle, and what a public investigation tied to a safety incident would look like in the trade press. She paused. Then I thought about what it would mean to let a man who came into my hangar at 2:39 in the morning walk away clean because the truth was inconvenient for my fourth quarter numbers. And that was enough. That was enough. She gathered her phone and her tablet bag and paused at the door. Your daughter, she said. Does she know you're good at your job? Something in his expression shifted again. That same simple, less defended thing she'd seen before. She knows I notice things, he said. She told me once that I look at the ground too much, that I should look up more. She's right, probably. Most 8-year-olds are, he said, about the large things. Eleanor left the crew lounge and walked back into the hangar where Okafor and Caruso were doing a final walk of the evidence markers, and Carver was on the phone with what sounded like a very uncomfortable conversation being delivered to someone who had not anticipated receiving it today. The chalk circles were still on the floor. Nobody had touched them, and nobody was going to, not until the investigators had documented everything and cleared the space. She looked at them one more time as she crossed toward the hangar office to make the call to her board chair. 3 circles. Yellow chalk. A man who looked at floors. What she knew, standing there, was that in 48 hours the Harwick evaluation team would receive a full briefing on the security event at Madison Aeros, including the complete record of how it had been discovered and managed, because she had decided that morning that the presentation she would make in Washington on Friday would be more complete and more true than the one she had originally prepared, not less. She had not yet told Mason what she was thinking regarding his future involvement with the company. That conversation was for another moment, when the immediate work of the day was done and there was space to have it properly. But she had already made the decision. Some decisions made themselves, if you paid attention to the right things. The call to the board chair lasted 41 minutes. Eleanor made it from the hangar office, sitting at a metal desk that belonged to the airfield's operations manager and smelled faintly of machine oil and old coffee, with the door closed and the sounds of the investigation muffled but still present through the thin partition wall. She told the board chair everything, not the managed version, not the version shaped to minimize alarm. Everything, in the sequence it had happened, including the parts that reflected badly on the company's internal security protocols and the parts that raised questions about Connor Vale's original hiring that she could not yet answer. The board chair was a 70-year-old man named Aldridge, who had known Raymond Madison for 30 years and had the specific quality of old men who had survived enough corporate disasters to stop being surprised by them. He listened without interrupting, which Eleanor had always considered his most valuable professional attribute. When she finished, he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." She looked at the wall for a moment. "I don't know yet. I'll have a better answer in about a week. The board needs to meet before Friday. Emergency session tomorrow morning." "I know. I'll send everything tonight. The evidence documentation, the financial analysis, Carver's legal summary. I want the board to have the complete picture before we're in a room together, not during." "And the Harwick presentation?" "Rescheduled to Friday. I'm going in person." A pause. "Some board members will argue that the instability makes a postponement advisable, that we should let the investigation settle before—" "I'm not postponing," she said. "If I walk into that presentation and tell the Harwick team exactly what happened, how it was discovered, how we responded, what we're doing to address it, that is a stronger case for our company's values than a polished deck and a comfortable conference room." She paused. "We found sabotage because someone was paying attention to a floor. That's not a liability. That's a story about what this company actually is, if I tell it right." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have postponed," he said. "Not as a criticism, as a fact." "I know," she said. "We had different instincts about some things." "Yes," he said. "You do." And there was something in the way he said it that wasn't disapproval. Connor Vale was formally arrested at 2:14 in the afternoon. Okafor handled it with the same unhurried efficiency she'd brought to everything else. 2 federal officers, no unnecessary drama, Connor walking out of the airfield's south entrance in handcuffs with his jacket still buttoned and his face doing the specific work of a man who had decided that composure was the last thing he had left to control. Eleanor watched from across the parking area. She hadn't planned to watch. She'd been heading to her car. But she stopped when she heard the doors and stood there until the vehicle pulled away. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. There was no satisfaction in it, which surprised her. She'd expected something. Relief, maybe? Or the particular cold pleasure of a betrayal being formally acknowledged. What she felt instead was tired. The specific tiredness that came not from the length of a day, but from the concentration it had required. The sustained attention to a situation that kept revealing new dimensions every time she thought she'd found its edges. She thought about what Connor had started to say before she'd cut him off. It was already in motion. "Before you came on board." She'd stopped him because she hadn't wanted the explanation in that moment, hadn't trusted herself to hear it without it landing wrong, without it feeling like an attempt to distribute the weight of what he'd done across her father's memory. But standing in the parking lot watching the federal vehicle disappear down the access road, she let herself sit with it. Connor had been cultivated. Long before he was dangerous, he had been found and identified and slowly oriented toward a purpose that he had either chosen freely or been eased into so gradually that by the time it was fully formed, he was already committed to it. She didn't know which. She might never know. And the honest answer was that it didn't change the outcome. People were responsible for the choices they made regardless of how they got to them. But it changed something about how she held it. It was not simple. It had never been simple. That was the part she was going to have to make peace with. She got in her car and drove back to the city. The board met the next morning at 8. It was the shortest board meeting Eleanor had ever run. Not because the material was thin, but because she'd sent everything the night before, and the board members had done what prepared people do. They arrived having already formed their positions, which meant the meeting was about decisions rather than orientation. Two members argued for postponing the Harwick presentation. Eleanor presented her case for proceeding. The vote was 7-2 in her favor, which was decisive enough that the dissent was noted and moved past rather than debated. The board authorized Carver to coordinate fully with federal investigators, approved the emergency security audit of all company facilities, and accepted Eleanor's recommendation to begin an internal review of Connor Vale's tenure, every decision, every access, every contract he had touched, beginning with his original hire. She did not know what the review would find about her father's role in bringing Connor on. She had thought about it the night before, lying in her penthouse with the city below, not caring, again, working through the possibilities. The most likely answer was the least dramatic one. Raymond Madison had hired a competent logistics coordinator who had later been recruited into something else, and her father's judgment had been used against the company without his knowledge. That was the most probable story. It was also the one she was going to live with unless the evidence said otherwise, because she had learned something from the morning in the hangar, not to construct a narrative around an absence of evidence, but to go where the evidence actually led. She went where the evidence led. What it led to, in regard to her father, was inconclusive. She was going to let it stay that way. The Harwick presentation was on Friday at 2 o'clock in a federal building in Washington that smelled like recycled air and institutional carpet. Eleanor arrived in a car rather than an aircraft. The Meridian had been fully inspected and cleared by Thursday afternoon, but she'd decided on the drive without entirely examining why, and she'd learned to trust decisions her instincts made before her reasoning caught up with them. The evaluation team was 4 people. The lead was a quiet man named Foss, who asked questions with the patience of someone who had reviewed a lot of presentations and had a clear sense of what he was actually looking for versus what most companies thought he was looking for. Eleanor did not open with the polished deck. She opened by telling them what had happened at the airfield 6 days ago, not as a confession or a damage control maneuver, as a case study in how her company operated when something went wrong. She told them about the grounded aircraft and the unnoticed contractor and the chalk circles on the hangar floor. She told them about the access logs and the compound and the fuel line and the federal investigation that was now active. She told them about Connor Vale. She told them all of it. The room was quiet in a way that could have been disaster or could have been attention, and Eleanor had been in enough rooms to know that the two sometimes felt identical until someone spoke. Foss spoke first. "You're presenting a security failure as an argument for your company's reliability," he said. "I'm presenting our response to a security failure as evidence of how we operate," she said. "The failure happened. A floor contractor discovered it before it became something worse because he was paying attention, and we listened to him when it mattered. We didn't manage the story. We called federal investigators, we briefed our board completely, and I'm standing in front of you 6 days later telling you everything because I think the Harwick partnership deserves to know exactly who we are." Foss looked at her for a moment. "Most companies in your position would have managed the optics," he said. "I know. It would have been easier." "Yes. It also would have been the wrong call." She held his gaze. "You're evaluating companies to trust with the maintenance and integration of federal aviation infrastructure. I'd rather you know what we look like under pressure than present you with a version of us that only exists in a conference room." The evaluation ran for 2 hours. The technical Q&A was thorough and occasionally pointed, and Eleanor answered every question, including the one she didn't have complete answers to, by saying so and describing how she was addressing the gaps. She did not oversell. She did not smooth rough edges into false resolution. She went home on Friday evening without knowing the outcome. She found that she could live with that, which surprised her slightly. The formal offer came on Tuesday. Carver called at 9:17 in the morning and said, "Harwick has issued a letter of intent," in the tone of someone who had been professionally restrained about good news for as long as was professionally required and had now reached the outer limit. $420 million. 7-year partnership. Full systems integration, maintenance contract, and a safety consultation component that the Harwick team had added specifically in response to the security event. A provision for independent safety review by a qualified external consultant on all integrated systems. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she set it down on her desk and looked out the window at Chicago, which was doing what it always did, moving and cold and indifferent, and let herself feel the weight of 6 years of difficult choices arriving at a moment that was, despite everything, real. She called Park and told him the number. He made a sound that was not quite professional. She didn't hold it against him. Then she called Mason Reed. He answered on the third ring, which told her he'd seen her name and taken a moment before picking up. Not reluctance, she thought, but the habit of a careful person. The Harwick contract came through, she said. A pause. Congratulations. Thank you. She had thought about how to have this conversation and had decided the direct version was the right one because Mason Reed was a person who responded better to direct than to managed. I want to talk to you about something. When can you come in? Where? The Madison Aeros offices, downtown Chicago. She paused. I want to show you something. Quiet. He came in on Thursday afternoon wearing a jacket that was better than the contractor gear from the hangar, but still clearly the jacket of a man who wasn't accustomed to corporate buildings, which Eleanor appreciated because performed comfort would have been worse. She walked him through the company. Not the showroom version. The actual operational floors, the engineering division, the safety documentation center, the maintenance coordination team. She narrated without trying to impress him, because she'd already noticed that he was unimpressed by most things that were designed to impress and considerably more interested in things that actually worked. In the Safety Documentation Center, she stopped. I'm creating a new division, she said. Independent Safety Review. It sits outside the operational chain. It doesn't report to operations. It doesn't report to engineering. It reports directly to the board, with full authority to flag any flight, any decision, any system, and require a hold until the concern is resolved. She looked at him. No one can override a hold except the board itself, not the CEO, not anyone in the executive chain. He was looking at the room, at the documentation systems, the filing infrastructure, the wall of active maintenance records. Taking inventory. That's a significant structural change, he said. Yes. It'll create friction with operations. It's supposed to. He turned to look at her. You want me to run it. I want you to build it and run it. You'd have full authority to hire your own team, set your own protocols, design the review process from the ground up. The board would be your direct oversight, which means you'd be insulated from the kind of pressure that gets applied to internal safety officers in most companies. He was quiet for a moment. She had expected some version of immediate acceptance, because the offer was substantial, and the position was exactly the inverse of what had happened to him at Veriton. Authority instead of dismissal. Structural protection instead of vulnerability. But he stood there in silence long enough that she understood he was thinking about something more complicated than the offer itself. Can I ask you something? He said. Go ahead. Why me? Specifically. He said it without false modesty. It was a genuine question about her reasoning, not a prompt for reassurance. You could hire a credentialed safety director from any major firm, someone without the history, without the complications. The Veriton record will come up every time my name is attached to a company decision. Connor's attorney already tried to use it. I know. So why? She thought about how to answer it honestly. Because every safety officer I could hire from a major firm learned how to do this job inside systems that were already built, she said. They know how to work within structures. You know what happens when the structure fails to listen. Those are different kinds of knowledge, and I think the second one is rare and more important for what I'm trying to build here. She paused. Also, you walked into my hangar on the worst morning in recent company history and spent 4 hours fixing a problem that had nothing to do with your job, using a piece of chalk and a notebook, because something was wrong and you noticed it and you weren't willing to walk past it. She held his gaze. I want someone who does that. I don't know how to hire for that from a resume. He looked at the wall of maintenance records for a moment. The Veriton report, he said. The one I filed 8 years ago. If I take this position, I'd want to formally submit it for the public record through the federal investigation process. It's relevant. The compound used on your aircraft is a variant of the failure mode I documented. Someone with access to Veriton's internal research used that knowledge in what happened here. Eleanor had not known this. She absorbed it. You think the connection to Veriton is direct? I think it's worth proving. If Valden or their associates had access to Veriton's proprietary failure research, which would require someone inside Veriton to have provided it, that's a significantly larger case than what Connor Vale did in your hangar. She thought about that, about the size of what might be underneath this, and whether she was ready to be the company that pulled the thread on it. Submit the report, she said, to Okafor directly. Whatever it opens up, we'll deal with it. He nodded. Is that a yes? She said. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize over the past week, measured, honest, not performing anything in either direction. I need to tell my daughter first, he said. She thinks I fix floors. What will you tell her? I'll tell her I'm going to work with planes again. A pause. She'll probably ask if I get to fly them. Does she want to fly? She wants to do everything, he said. She's 8. Eleanor almost smiled again, the same way she had in the crew lounge, briefly and not entirely at her direction. There's one more thing, she said. She led him back through the main corridor, past the engineering floor, to the room that had been designated as the new safety division's primary office. It was a good-sized room on the corner of the building, with north and east windows that let in real light, which she had chosen specifically because it was the best room on that floor, and she wanted its location to say something about how the company regarded the work done inside it. On the wall beside the door, she'd had something mounted that morning, a frame. Inside it, a photograph. He stopped when he saw it. The photograph was from Bales's interior security camera footage, not high resolution, slightly washed out by the hangar's fluorescent light, but clear enough. It showed the hangar floor from the east wall camera angle, taken at 7:23 in the morning 6 days ago. 3 yellow chalk circles on gray concrete. And at the edge of the frame, crouched near the third circle with a notebook in his hand, Mason Reed. He stood in front of it without saying anything. She waited. You didn't have to do that, he said finally. I know. She looked at the photograph. The engineers who were in that hangar that morning, the ones who told you a floor contractor had no business analyzing an aircraft, 3 of them have already asked to meet with you, professionally, about the new division and how the review process will work. She paused. I thought you should know that. He was still looking at the photograph. She couldn't fully read his expression. It was something between recognition and the specific discomfort of a person not accustomed to being seen clearly. 8 years, he said. Not to her specifically, more to the photograph, or to whatever private accounting the image had triggered. Yes. I thought about the Veriton report every day for the first 3 years, he said. Then every week. Then it became something I carried the way you carry something heavy for long enough that you stop noticing the weight until someone asks you to set it down. He was quiet for a moment. This morning, before I drove here, my daughter asked me if I was nervous. What did you tell her? I told her yes. He looked at Eleanor. I don't usually tell her when I'm nervous about something. I didn't want to explain why. Why were you nervous? He considered the question with the same honesty he'd brought to every question she'd asked him over the past week. Because Veriton felt like proof that doing the right thing and being believed for it were 2 different outcomes, he said. And I'd spent 8 years not being sure which one I was going to get. You can know something is true and still not know if it's going to matter. She understood that. She understood it in the way of someone who had made choices that were right and expensive at the same time, who had learned that integrity was not a protection against difficulty, but a way of moving through difficulty without losing yourself in it. It mattered, she said, simply and without inflation. He looked at the photograph one more time. Then he turned away from it because he was not a person who dwelt in moments once the moment had been received. When do I start? He said. Monday, if that works. It works. What? 3 months later, the Madison Aero Safety Division had a staff of 4 and a review protocol that had already flagged 2 procedural concerns in the company's maintenance documentation. Neither of them dangerous, both of them the kind of small systemic drift that grew into larger problems over time if no one was watching for them. Mason had caught both within his first 6 weeks. He'd documented them in the same spare, time-stamped way he'd documented everything in his notebook, and he'd presented them to the board in a meeting that lasted 20 minutes and resulted in 2 operational changes. The engineers respected him. Not warmly initially. There was a period of adjustment during which the operational team worked through the specific friction of having an independent authority that could stop their work for reasons they didn't always immediately agree with. But Mason was patient, and he explained his reasoning every time. And he was right enough times in a row that the disagreement shifted from territorial to professional, which was a different and more productive kind. Garrett, the maintenance supervisor who had handed over the chalk with barely concealed contempt back in October, stopped by the safety office one Tuesday afternoon in January with a technical question about vapor recovery system inspection intervals. He asked it without preamble and waited for the answer with the posture of someone who had decided that expertise was expertise regardless of where it came from. Mason gave him a thorough answer. Garrett said thanks and left. Neither of them mentioned the chalk. The federal investigation into Connor Vale and the Valden Group expanded significantly once Mason submitted the Veritin report to Okafor. The compound used in the fuel system was traced to proprietary research conducted at Veritin 7 years earlier, research that had been accessed through a data breach that Veritin had never publicly disclosed. The breach was connected to a consulting firm with documented ties to Valden. 2 additional executives were charged. The Valden director named Mercer was indicted in February. Connor Vale pled guilty in March to charges that included criminal conspiracy, attempted manslaughter, and securities fraud. His sentencing was scheduled for the fall. Eleanor did not follow the coverage closely. She had made her statement to investigators, submitted the full company documentation, and decided that the legal process was the legal process, and her attention was better spent on what she was building rather than what had been done to her. She was not entirely successful at this. There were mornings when she drove to the office and thought about what the alternative version of that October morning would have looked like. The aircraft at altitude, the engine failing, the outcome that Connor and Mercer and Valden had been counting on. She thought about it the way you thought about a car that had nearly hit you on the highway, involuntarily, briefly, with the residual cold of something that had been very close. And then she went upstairs and did the work. Call. On a Thursday afternoon in April, 6 months after everything, Eleanor stood in the safety division office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she'd been reading a technical review report and looked at the photograph on the wall. 3 chalk circles. Gray concrete. One corner of a man who had been looking at the right things at the right time. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her what the lesson of it was. The clean takeaway, the tidy moral. She had been asked versions of this question in 3 industry interviews, and a board presentation, and once by a journalist who was writing a piece on corporate safety culture, and she had given versions of an answer each time that were accurate without being complete. The complete version was harder to compress. It was something like this. The most dangerous assumption in any organization was that expertise announced itself, that the people who mattered were the ones who were supposed to matter, who had the right credentials and the right title and the right access, and that the unnoticed people, the floor contractors, the junior engineers, the ones whose job descriptions didn't include the problem currently breaking down, could be safely ignored until the hierarchy had a chance to address it. Companies built entire structures around that assumption. Entire industries ran on it. And it was wrong. It was wrong in the specific and costly way of things that were comfortable to believe and catastrophic to rely on. Mason Reed had not been supposed to notice the stair position at 6:12 in the morning. He had not been supposed to hear the silence in the aircraft's mechanical signature in a way that meant something. He had not been supposed to understand what the floor was telling him about the machine above it. None of that was his job. All of it was what he was. The real question, the one that had stayed with Eleanor in the months since, was not how he had noticed. It was what it cost a system when it refused to listen to people who noticed things. Because Connor Vale's sabotage had been sophisticated, and it had very nearly worked. But it had not been defeated by the hierarchy. It had not been caught by the senior engineers running diagnostics on an engine. It had been caught by a man with a pencil and 47 pages of notes, and the specific stubbornness of someone who had been ignored before and had decided that the answer to that experience was not to stop noticing things, but to document everything and hold on. The Veritin report had sat inside a system that chose not to receive it for 8 years. 3 aircraft had nearly failed. A company had protected its image at the cost of its integrity, and Mason Reed had carried the truth of it alone, in digital backups, and in his own accounting of himself, until a morning arrived when someone was willing to look at where he was pointing. She thought about the 8-year-old who had told him he looked at the ground too much. She hoped somebody told that child, someday, that her father's habit of looking at the ground was what kept a plane from falling out of the sky. She set down the cold coffee and looked at the photograph one last time. 3 circles. Machines always warned people before they failed. Mason had said that in the hangar, quietly, as a fact. Eleanor had turned it over many times since. She thought it was true of more than machines. She thought organizations warned people too, and families, and relationships. Small signals, accumulating, in the patterns and the dust and the things that sat slightly wrong if you were willing to stay still long enough to see them. The question was never whether the warning was there. The question was whether anyone was paying attention, and whether, when someone said, "I see something," the people around them could stop being certain long enough to look. That was the thing she was building now, not just a safety division, not just a protocol, a company where that question had a different answer than it used to. She didn't know if she would get it exactly right. She probably wouldn't. There would be moments when the friction was too high and the review process slowed something critical, and the cost of the independence she'd built into it would be visible and uncomfortable. There would be moments when she'd be tempted to override it because she was the CEO and she understood the urgency, and surely this one time the structure could bend. She knew herself well enough to know that she would be wrong in those moments, and she hoped she would know it in time. That was the most honest thing she could say about it. She was trying to build something better than she was individually capable of sustaining on her own judgment alone, because she had spent 6 years believing that her judgment was the most reliable thing in the company, and one October morning had shown her the cost of that belief with enough clarity to last. Down the hall, Mason Reed was in a meeting with Torres and 2 engineers from the maintenance team, working through the inspection protocol for the fuel vapor management systems across the company's contracted fleet. Torres had specifically requested the meeting. She had become one of the more consistent advocates for the safety division's work among the operational staff, which Mason had mentioned to Eleanor once, matter-of-factly, as information rather than praise. Eleanor finished looking at the photograph. She picked up her cold coffee, considered it, and went to make a fresh cup. The building was warm. Outside, Chicago was doing what it did. The afternoon was unremarkable, and there was a great deal of work left to finish before the end of the day, and she was, for the first time in a long time, entirely clear on what she was working toward. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough.